Ever wondered how someone knew who was who in medieval society without fancy titles or grand estates? Get ready to unlock the hidden language of medieval fashion. We're diving deep into the surprisingly complex world of common people's clothing to show you how even the simplest garments told a profound story about their wearers, status, and place in the world. The Middle Ages were not the flat, monochrome blur we've been taught to imagine. They were layered, textured like the very fabrics that clothed their people. The image of a mud-smeared peasant wrapped in a single, coarse tunic, indistinguishable from his neighbors, is an illusion painted by centuries of oversimplification. The truth is stranger, subtler, and far more human. There was a quiet code running through the warp and weft of their garments, a language, not written in ink, but stitched, dyed, and woven into daily life. To the untrained eye, it might have been invisible, but to those who knew how to read it, a man's sleeve length could whisper of his trade, a woman's hemline could hint at her marital prospects, and the very shade of wool on your back could draw the line between respect and ridicule. This was the realm of microstatus, social hierarchies that existed not just between kings and commoners, but within the vast, unseen middle ground of everyday life. A shepherd in his 30s might outrank a young farmhand simply because his tunic was made from better processed wool. A village artisan could outshine the local miller with a slightly brighter dye in his cloak, proof of access to rarer plants. Or a merchant's trade route. These weren't grand gestures. They were quiet, deliberate markers that could mean the difference between being approached with respect or dismissed entirely. If you stood in a market square in the 14th century, the signals would be everywhere, though you might not notice them unless you knew where to look. Start with the fabric. Coarse homespun wool, thick with lanolin and irregular in texture, marked the poor farmer's everyday garb. But finer, carded wool, smoother to the touch, softer against the skin, hinted that the wearer had the means or the connections to access better weaving. Even linen, the staple for undergarments, carried quiet gradations. Unbleached linen spoke of necessity. The raw plant fibers worked just enough to be wearable. Lightly bleached linen, subtly paler, suggested extra labor, extra resources, and a subtle nudge toward refinement. And then there were the anomalies, commoners who dared to wear imported cotton or fustian. Cotton was not the everyday fabric of medieval Europe. It traveled along perilous trade routes, often blended with linen to make it affordable. Fustian, linen warped with cotton weft, was a textile whisper from far-off lands, worn by those who wanted to signal that they were not merely local, but worldly. It was a flex, though a quiet one, like wearing a watch that only a trained eye could identify as rare. Even tailoring itself was a statement. A well-fitted tunic, though plain, suggested not only the money to afford a skilled seamstress or tailor, but also the luxury of owning more than one garment, enough to rotate and keep them in good repair. Sleeve lengths mattered. A slightly longer sleeve, tailored to drape with deliberate ease, could echo aristocratic trends, muted enough not to break sumptuary laws, but clear enough to be noticed. Hemlines shifted in small increments, often mirroring the upper classes but lagging behind by a few years. These shifts were not accidental. They were a form of fashion espionage, a slow adoption of elite styles filtered down into the working world. For women, the cut of a gown skirt could speak volumes. A slightly wider skirt wasn't just a comfort for work, it was a subtle luxury. It required more fabric, and fabric was currency. To wear such a skirt was to declare, without words, that you had enough resources to spend on what was not strictly necessary. But perhaps the most delicate and easily overlooked signals came from color. Natural dyes created a spectrum of earth tones, browns, beiges, muted greens. These were affordable, stable, and worn by most. But certain colors, even faint ones, suggested more. A dull but distinct blue might have come from woad, a plant that required time and skill to process. A softer, lingering red from madder root, or a gentle yellow from weld, hinted at either extra cost or access to dye makers with specialized knowledge. Brighter colors were more difficult to achieve, and even when faded, they carried the memory of vibrancy, a silent declaration of the wearer's position. Embroidery, too, crept into the equation. Not the gold-threaded extravagance of nobility, but homemade patterns worked into cuffs, necklines, or hems. A simple row of stitches could mark identity, heritage, or skill, something quietly displayed each time a sleeve was rolled or a garment shifted in the wind. Trim, often woven separately and stitched on, could be reused from older garments, carrying with it the history of past generations and sometimes the echoes of places far beyond the village's edge. Accessories completed the picture. Belts weren't merely functional. They could be carved, dyed, or tipped with simple metalwork that told of a craftsman's touch. Pouches were both utility and statement, often decorated just enough to suggest pride in one's work or trade. Head coverings, kerchiefs for women, coifs or caps for men, were not just about modesty or warmth. They were subtle markers of age, marital status, or occupation, their shape and fabric as much a part of the silent language as anything else worn on the body. What is perhaps most fascinating is how modern this all feels. The medieval commoners. Quiet signaling is not unlike today's understated brands, minimalist watches, or hand-tailored jackets worn by those who know their worth doesn't need to shout. We may think we've moved beyond such things, but the truth is we've only changed the medium. Where they spoke in wool and dye, we speak in stitching and logos. The language remains the same, unspoken, coded, and deeply human. If fabric and cut were the first layer of medieval fashion's hidden language, the second layer was far more dangerous because it flirted with the boundaries of law, religion, and power. What we wear has always been political, but in the Middle Ages, clothing could quite literally decide your fate. In a world where rigid hierarchies kept the powerful insulated from the masses, even a small breach in the visual order of things could provoke suspicion, punishment, or worse. Enter the sumptuary laws, a system designed to police not just what nobles wore, but what commoners dared to imitate. To the crown and the church, clothing wasn't just cloth, it was order made visible. The cut of a tunic, the shade of a dye, the richness of a trim, all were considered part of the visual architecture of society. If the lower orders began to blur these lines, they threatened the very scaffolding that held medieval life in place. And so laws were written. A yeoman might not wear certain furs. A merchant's wife might not own a gown dyed too deeply in scarlet. A laborer could be fined for belts tipped with silver. But here is where the story gets interesting. Laws can dictate the letter of the cloth, but they can't control the cunning of the needle. Across Europe, there emerged a quiet arms race of subversion. Commoners learned how to skirt the edge, both figuratively and literally, by wearing muted versions of forbidden colors, slightly altering their cuts so they echoed elite fashion without directly copying it. Woad blue could be dulled with brown dye. Expensive fabrics could be mimicked with carefully brushed wool. Embroidery patterns could borrow from aristocratic motifs but be worked in humble thread. And sometimes, it wasn't just about copying the elites. It was about creating entirely separate codes. In many villages, certain sleeve folds, headscarf knots, or belt placements had meanings that outsiders couldn't decipher. A visitor from another shire might see nothing unusual in a man's patched tunic, but locals would know that the way the patch was cut, diagonal instead of square, marked him as an elder of the milling guild. The meaning was invisible to lords, but crystal clear to the community that lived and worked under their shadow. Even more fascinating is how certain trades weaponized clothing as a kind of psychological leverage. A blacksmith with burnished Soot-darkened clothes carried a visual authority in rural life. The proof of his skill was literally worn into his garments. A traveling merchant's patched, yet well-kept cloak said something different. Here was a man who could endure hardship, who valued resourcefulness over excess. In marketplaces and fairs, such clothing acted like an unspoken business card. People learned to read these signs instinctively, because to misread them could mean the difference between trust and betrayal. Religious life wove its own signals into everyday dress. Pilgrimage badges, small lead or pewter tokens sewn onto caps or cloaks, were as much a declaration of spiritual currency as they were of physical travel. To wear the scallop shell of Santiago or the cross of Jerusalem marked you as someone who had crossed borders, braved dangers, and returned. Such tokens could raise your standing in the eyes of neighbors, even if your daily life was no richer than before, but not all symbols were so openly displayed. In a world where heresy was a death sentence, certain dissident groups developed hidden embroidery patterns or specific stitch counts within seams, known only to their members. Archaeologists have occasionally found such garments in waterlogged peat or church crypts. Tunics whose visible side looks entirely ordinary, but whose inner seams hide curious repetitions, like a message written backwards, visible only to the initiated. Was it superstition? A coded rebellion? We may never fully know. And then there is the matter of imported cloth. To own a fragment of Florentine wool or a length of Flemish broadcloth was more than a luxury. It was a statement that your world was larger than your parish. But how would a farmer's son in northern England come by such cloth? Sometimes through trade fairs, sometimes as hand-me-downs from merchants who passed through, and sometimes, more mysteriously, through smuggling. Smuggled fabrics, unrecorded, untaxed, could appear suddenly in rural villages far from the nearest port. Wearing such a piece wasn't just a style choice. It was a calculated risk, one that carried both prestige and danger. All of this tells us something profound. Clothing was never simply about keeping warm. It was a battlefield, quiet, intimate, and fought in the open for all to see, though few understood the true stakes. Each stitch, each fold, each hue was a move in an ongoing negotiation between identity and conformity, between survival and aspiration. And perhaps this is why, even in the humblest garments, we find echoes of something older, an inheritance from a time when textiles themselves carried sacred or talismanic weight. Some historians speculate that certain medieval patterns, especially in borders and trims, may descend from ancient protective designs handed down through centuries of weaving tradition. If this is true, then the peasants of medieval Europe were not just wearing social symbols. They were wearing fragments of a far older language, one whose meaning has been mostly lost, but whose presence still lingers in museum drawers and archaeological finds. That older language of cloth, the one we can barely glimpse, suggests that fashion, even at its most practical, was part of a continuum stretching back into antiquity. Perhaps the reason commoners clung to certain patterns or dyes was not only status, but memory, a memory of a time before written laws, before centralized power, when clothing spoke of kinship, survival, and the unseen forces that shaped life itself. The deeper we look, the more it becomes clear. In medieval Europe, the clothes of the common people were not just shadows of noble dress. They were their own archive, storing personal, communal, and possibly ancient truths in every fold. And those truths were hidden in plain sight, worn daily, weathered by work and time, until they became so familiar that no one thought to question them, except those who knew how to read the code. And yet, there is still another layer to peel back, a layer where fashion becomes not just personal or political, but almost philosophical. A layer where the medieval commoner's tunic becomes a mirror, reflecting both the fragility and the resilience of human identity across centuries. If the clothes of the medieval commoner were a code, then the final question we must ask is, who was the code truly for? Was it for the lords and overseers, to remind them of the distance between ruler and ruled? Was it for one's neighbors, a way to navigate the subtleties of alliance and rivalry? Or was it for the self, an intimate, wearable map of identity in a world where individuality was often swallowed by survival? The deeper we trace this thread, the more it begins to feel as though these garments were more than social markers. They were personal archives. Every stain from the market, every fray from the fields, every careful patch sewn late at night by candlelight was a line in a biography written without ink. To own clothing, any clothing, was to own a part of your story you could carry with you. And in an age when many left behind no written record, that story might be the only one that survived. Imagine the interior of a medieval chest, the kind found in the corner of a modest timber-framed home. Inside, a folded linen shift, faintly, smelling of lye soap, a woolen tunic, mended at the elbows with care, a belt that had been shortened twice, as its wearer grew from boy to man. These items might look humble, even dull, to a modern eye. Yet each was once chosen, valued, and worn with the same small calculations we still make today: how it would be seen, what it would say, and whether it would endure. And perhaps that is the most enduring truth. Fashion, in its quietest form, is not about excess. It is about communication. We speak with it constantly, even when we think we are silent. We speak to strangers on the road, to the people we love, to the ghosts of who we once were and who we hope to be. The medieval commoner's patched tunic and today's understated luxury share the same root. They are signals cast into the air, hoping someone will read them correctly. But there is one final, unsettling thought. If every fold of fabric carries meaning, then our modern clothes, mass-produced, logo-stamped, and globally recognized, are broadcasting our stories to far more people than we realize. In the medieval world, the code could be subtle, local, even secret. Today, our visual language is nearly universal, and that means our identities are far more exposed. Perhaps we have not abandoned the medieval way of speaking through dress at all. Perhaps we have only stripped away its privacy. What, then, will the archaeologists of the future find in the closets of our time? Will they see only fabric and stitching, or will they decode the messages we didn't even know we were sending? And if they do, what will they think we were trying to say? Because beneath the surface of medieval wool and linen lies a truth that has never changed. Clothing is not just what we wear. It is who we are, translated into color, shape, and thread. And long after our voices have faded, our garments may still be speaking, whispering the language of status, desire, and belonging. To anyone who cares to listen, and maybe, just maybe, they'll see that we, too, were climbing our own invisible ladders, one quiet stitch at a time. If you enjoyed this journey into the hidden codes of medieval fashion, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe so you never miss the stories they don't teach in school. And tell me in the comments, what do your clothes say about you?